The morning air at Tullamarine Airport was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of impending rain. A typical Melbourne start to a day that would alter the course of my life forever. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel of my Ford Ranger, watching Sharon step out of the vehicle. She looked impeccable in her tailored navy coat, her hair styled with that effortless precision she had mastered over our decade together. To any casual observer, she was the epitome of a successful executive heading to a critical meeting in Perth. "Have a safe flight, dear," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. She leaned in, her lips grazing my cheek with a coolness that, in retrospect, lacked the warmth of genuine affection. "Do not wait up, Arthur. The conference will likely run until late, and I may stay overnight at the hotel near the terminal if the flight is delayed." Her smile was dazzling, the kind that had once blinded me to the subtle cracks in our marriage. I watched her walk through the automatic doors, her heels clicking against the concrete with a rhythmic, confident pace. She did not look back. I put the truck in gear and turned to check on Leo, my 8-year-old son, who had been uncharacteristically quiet in the back seat. "Say goodbye to your mother, Leo," I prompted gently. But Leo did not speak. He was huddled in the far corner of the leather seat, his knees pulled tightly against his chest. His small frame was trembling, a rhythmic vibration that had nothing to do with the car's air conditioning. It was a visceral, raw fear. "Now, what is the matter, son?" I asked, my voice softening as I pulled away from the departure terminal. He climbed forward, his small hands gripping my shoulder with a strength that betrayed his agitation. "Dad, we cannot go home," he whispered. The intensity in his voice caused a chill to settle in my marrow. "Please, Dad, do not drive home." I offered a forced, nervous chuckle, attempting to deflect the weight of his words. "What are you talking about, Leo? It is Friday. We have our pizza night planned. It is just you and me." "No," he screamed, a sound that cracked the silence of the cabin. "Mom is not going to Perth." She lied. I heard her on the phone in the bathroom this morning. She thought I was asleep, but I heard her talking to Lachlan. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. Lachlan, my son-in-law, a man I had bankrolled for months to keep his failing logistics startup afloat, a man who shared our Sunday dinners with a polite smile that never reached his eyes. I pulled the vehicle onto the shoulder of the highway, the hazard lights clicking in a rhythmic, haunting cadence. I turned to face my son, whose eyes were wide and brimming with unshed tears. "Tell me exactly what you heard, Leo," I commanded, my voice hollow. He shuddered, struggling to form the words. She said, "Tonight is the last night for the old man. The tea has soaked in enough. His heart will just stop, and it will look like an accident." And she told Lachlan to bring the firearm, just in case the poison was not enough. The world seemed to lose its color. My chest felt tight, a dull ache that I had dismissed as age-related stress over the past few weeks, suddenly taking on a sinister clarity. For months, Sharon had insisted on brewing my evening tea, citing health benefits. I had looked my killer in the eyes and thanked her for every cup. I did not drive toward our home in the leafy suburbs. Instead, I turned the truck around, my mind racing through the logistics of survival. I steered into a dark, overgrown lot across from our subdivision, killing the lights and the engine. "Stay down, Leo," I whispered, pulling a blanket over his small frame. 10 minutes later, the headlights of a black SUV cut through the darkness. It did not enter the driveway. It stopped at the curb. Sharon stepped out, not with luggage, but with a key in her hand. Beside her, Lachlan emerged, his posture predatory and eager. As he pulled her into a hungry, possessive embrace under the streetlight, the silence of my world became absolute. The mechanic in me had spent 40 years fixing problems, but tonight I realized I was the one being scheduled for dismantling. The transition from the gala's controlled environment to the suffocating chill of the service alley felt like stepping into a different dimension of reality. The security guards discarded Hunter and Sharon onto the damp asphalt with a mechanical indifference that was as clinical as it was satisfying. Hunter scrambled to his knees, his breath forming frantic white plumes in the freezing Melbourne night. He looked around with a dilated, erratic eyes of a cornered animal, searching for an exit that did not exist. The alley was blocked. For police cruisers formed a tactical perimeter, their emergency lights painting the brick walls in rhythmic splashes of crimson and blue. Detective Miller stepped out of the lead vehicle, his posture weary but resolute. He moved toward Hunter with the steady deliberation of a man who had spent his career cataloging the depths of human depravity. Hunter, seeing the handcuffs, tried to straighten his oversized suit jacket, a pathetic attempt to reclaim a dignity that had evaporated days ago. "Detective, thank God you are here," he stammered, his good hand raised in a desperate gesture of supplication. "My father-in-law has lost his mind. He has a weapon. You need to go inside and arrest him." Miller halted 2 feet away, looking down at him with a gaze devoid of sympathy. He withdrew a folded document from his coat pocket. "Hunter Vance, you are under arrest." He began to recite the charges. 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, aggravated assault, and a laundry list of financial crimes. Each charge was a heavy nail in the coffin of Hunter's delusions. The detective's voice was steady, a stark contrast to the frantic whimpering of the man on the ground. Hunter tried to retreat, his voice rising into a sharp, hysterical pitch. "This is a setup. The old man is hallucinating. He is not even supposed to be alive. We have the text messages, Hunter," Miller replied, signaling to the officers. "We have the toxicology reports, and we have the confession of the man who supplied the arsenic. Your game is over." As the officers tightened their grip, Hunter shrieked in agony, his broken arm colliding with the steel of the cruiser. He was shoved into the back seat, his face pressed against the glass, screaming soundlessly as the vehicle began to pull away. Sharon remained pinned against the brickwork, her breath hitching in her throat. She had watched her accomplice vanish into the night, leaving her utterly exposed. Detective Miller approached her, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Vance, we will be in touch. Do not leave the state." He turned and walked away, leaving her in the flicker of a single, dying security light. She thought the night was a victory of silence. But as the police cars disappeared, 3 figures emerged from the shadows near the dumpsters. They were not law enforcement. Their heavy leather jackets and hollow eyes spoke of a different brand of authority. Sharon froze, the cold of the alley now seeping into her very bones. The leader, a man with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow, held out a promissory note. "Your husband had a bad habit of using other people's names on his debt, Sharon," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "He signed this loan in your name. Since he is now a guest of the state, the interest on this debt has become your responsibility." Sharon's voice was a barely audible whimper. "I have no money. Please." "We don't deal in money anymore," the man replied, moving into her space. "We deal in consequences." I stood behind the heavy steel of the loading dock door, watching through the narrow slit of the frame. I did not move to intervene. I did not offer mercy. I simply reached out and engaged the deadbolt, closing the door on the final chapter of my old life. The scream that echoed from the alley was sharp and final, a sound that vanished into the vastness of the city, leaving nothing behind but the cold, clean promise of a new beginning. The drive to the Crown Towers felt like a surreal passage into a world I had intentionally left behind decades ago. I had spent 40 years cultivating the persona of Arthur Miller, the hardworking mechanic who valued grease-stained overalls over silk suits. Now, as the city lights blurred past the windows of the Ford Ranger, I felt the heavy cloak of that identity beginning to fray. Beside me, Leo sat in a rigid, watchful silence, his small hand clutching the center console, as if it were an anchor keeping him grounded in reality. We abandoned the truck in a secluded corner of the parking structure, leaving the doors unlocked. I navigated the labyrinthine service corridors of the hotel, an area I had not traversed since my final days as a corporate strategist, and retreated to the penthouse suite I had maintained in total secrecy. It was a sterile, cold sanctuary of glass and steel, perched high above the Yarra River. The air smelled of expensive filtration and loneliness, a stark contrast to the home I had spent a lifetime building in the suburbs. I pulled the satellite phone from the lining of my jacket, a relic of a bygone era in my career, and dialed the number for Vance. He answered on the first ring, his voice clipped and efficient, stripped of its civilian veneer. "Status," he demanded, bypassing the need for pleasantries. "I've been poisoned, Vance," I said, my voice raspy. "Arsenic. Chronic, low-level ingestion. I need a medical team at the penthouse. Protocol 7. Bring the portable toxicology lab and the chelation supplies. I need you to perform the analysis yourself." There was a profound silence on the other end, followed by a heavy, sharp intake of breath. "Bernie? Is that you? If this is true, you need to reach the hospital immediately." "If I go to the hospital, there will be a record," I countered, my eyes fixed on the panoramic view of Melbourne's skyline. "If there is a record, Sharon will know I am still alive. She needs to believe she has succeeded. Treat me here, Vance. Use your discretion, but ensure the findings are encrypted." Vance arrived within 30 minutes, slipping through the freight elevator with the shadow-like grace of a man accustomed to keeping secrets. He did not ask questions. He simply set up his mobile lab on the dining table, his movements methodical and precise. As he drew vial after vial of blood, I sat in the corner, watching Leo as he curled into an armchair, finally surrendering to exhaustion. "The levels are high, Arthur," Vance said, his face pale under the clinical glow of his portable monitor. "Ingestion has been consistent for months. A few more doses would have induced cardiac arrest. How could you not have noticed?" "Because I wanted to trust her," I replied, the confession feeling like a jagged stone in my throat. I mistook her ambition for companionship and her precision for affection. I watched as the machine whirred, processing the evidence of a betrayal that had been served to me nightly in a ceramic mug. The nausea was an encroaching tide, a physical manifestation of the lie I had lived. My body was a battleground, fighting a war I hadn't realized was being waged until the 11th hour. "I need you to survive this," Vance said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "But you cannot return to that house. You are walking into a grave." "I'm not going back as the man she poisoned," I said, my voice hardening into an edge that hadn't been tempered for years. "I'm going back as the man who is going to dismantle everything they believe they have stolen." I looked down at my hands that had spent years fixing carburetors and balancing ledgers. They were no longer the hands of a retired mechanic. They were the hands of a man preparing to reclaim his empire. As the chelation medication began to flow through my veins, I felt the first sparks of a cold, calculated clarity. The game had shifted. I was no longer the prey. I was the architect of their downfall. The weight of the plan felt like an iron shackle around my wrists, but there was no turning back. To reclaim my life, I first had to incinerate the identity of Arthur Miller. It was a cold, pragmatic necessity. I spent the remainder of the night in the silence of the penthouse, mapping out the architecture of my own disappearance. I needed Sharon and Lachlan to believe that Arthur Miller had reached the end of his road, broken by the very secrets they had used to poison him. Vance was hesitant, his professional ethics clashing with the grim reality of our situation. "If we execute the crash, Arthur, there is no reversing it. The authorities will recover the wreckage, they will perform an autopsy, and they will certify you as deceased. You will cease to exist in every database that matters." "That is exactly the point," I replied, staring at the blueprints of the Great Ocean Road spread across the dining table. "I need the world to stop looking for me. If she thinks I am dead, her guard will drop. She will reach for the assets. She will expose her intentions to the executors, and she will make a mistake. In that moment of absolute hubris, I will be the ghost that haunts her." I spent the dawn hours preparing the vehicle. It had to be convincing, a tragic end for a man who had apparently lost his way. I drove my Ford Ranger toward the rugged, winding cliffs of the Great Ocean Road, the engine's hum a rhythmic reminder of the life I was abandoning. Every mile of the coastline was a memory I had to strip away. The cliffs loomed, indifferent and ancient, overlooking the churning surf of the Southern Ocean. I positioned the truck near a section of the road where the guardrail was weak, a spot known for its dangerous, sharp decline. I ensured the internal logs were wiped and placed a decoy in the driver's seat, a mannequin dressed in my familiar work attire, saturated with just enough synthetic fluid to mimic the aftermath of an impact. As I set the parking brake to release and watched the truck shudder and plunge toward the rocky abyss below, a surge of adrenaline masked the lingering pain of the arsenic in my system. The vehicle hit the rocks with a resounding, hollow thud, followed by an explosion of flame as the fuel tank ignited. The fire was a beacon in the morning mist. I retreated into the dense eucalyptus forest that bordered the cliffside, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. From the safety of the foliage, I watched the smoke plume rise into the sky, a final, dark signal that Arthur Miller had reached his conclusion. I was no longer a husband, a father, or a mechanic. I was a void, a specter existing in the peripheral vision of those who had wronged me. I made my way back to the extraction point where Dante was waiting, his unmarked sedan idling in the shadows of an access road. He looked at me with a grim, knowing expression as I climbed into the passenger seat. "The scene is secure," Dante said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The authorities will find what they expect to find. As of this moment, Arthur Miller is a casualty of his own misfortune." I looked back at the smoke one last time, feeling a strange, hollow peace. The hardest part was not the deception. It was the realization that I had become a stranger to the people I had cherished. But as I pulled my collar up against the biting wind, I knew this was merely the price of survival. I had burned the bridge, and now there was nothing left to do but walk through the fire toward the ones who had lit the match. My path was clear. I would return to them not as the man they had poisoned, but as the reckoning they had earned. The days following my supposed demise were a surreal exercise in observation. From the clandestine monitoring station Dante had established in a nondescript office in South Bank, I watched the disintegration of my family through a high-definition lens. The footage was grainy, but it captured the jagged edges of their true characters with crystalline clarity. My house, which I had spent 4 decades transforming into a sanctuary, was being systematically desecrated. I watched Sharon and Lachlan through the hidden cameras Dante had installed in the vents and smoke detectors. They no longer felt the need to perform the role of the grieving widow and the loyal son-in-law. Instead, they moved through the living room with the manic, frantic energy of scavengers picking a carcass clean. Sharon was tireless, pulling books from the shelves, tearing apart the upholstery of my favorite reading chair, and prying paintings from the walls in a desperate search for the hidden wealth she believed I had concealed. One evening, I watched them celebrate my death with a vintage bottle of scotch from my private collection. Lachlan sat in my chair, his feet propped up on the coffee table, tossing the keys to my Ford Ranger, or rather, the ghost of it, into the air. Their conversation was a chilling litany of greed. They spoke of the logistics of my estate, the speed at which they could liquidate the assets of Jefferson Logistics, and their plans to relocate to a private villa in the Whitsundays once the probate process cleared. But it was the moment they spoke of Chloe that ignited a cold, lethal fire in my chest. Lachlan leaned over, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "The daughter is becoming a complication," he remarked, pouring himself another glass. "She still holds a sentimental attachment to the company's legacy. She might fight us on the restructuring if we are not careful." Sharon sighed, her face hardening into a mask of cruel indifference. "She is weak, just like her father. If she does not sign the documents transferring her shares by the end of the month, we will find a way to make her compliance mandatory. We have waited long enough to inherit this empire. I will not let sentimentality derail our future." My stomach turned. I had spent years protecting Chloe, insulating her from the harsh realities of the industry, only to realize I had inadvertently turned her into a target for the very people I had welcomed into our home. They viewed her not as a daughter or a sister-in-law, but as an obstacle to be bypassed or crushed. Dante shifted in a chair beside me, his eyes glued to the monitor. "They're not just after the money, Arthur. They are planning to dismantle your entire legacy, brick by brick. If they succeed, Chloe will be left with nothing but the debris. They will not succeed, I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, cold, measured, and devoid of the hesitation that had defined my life as Arthur Miller. I leaned closer to the screen, watching Sharon trace the outline of a map on my desk. They were so confident in their victory, so intoxicated by the power they believed they had seized, that they failed to notice the shadows growing in the corners of their own lives. They thought they had buried a mechanic, but they had actually unearthed the man who had built that empire from a single, rusted van. As I watched them toast to their supposed freedom, I felt the final fragments of my former self dissolve. There was no room left for empathy or caution. The time for observation had ended. The era of intervention was about to begin. I had the recordings, the financial trail, and the evidence of their conspiracy. I was ready to bring the ceiling down on their heads. The honeymoon period of their inheritance was abruptly curtailed by the cold, mechanical reality of the financial system I had set in motion. From my vantage point in the South Bank office, I watched as the walls of their new, stolen reality began to crumble. I had spent the last decade diversifying my assets into secure, multi-layered trusts that were specifically designed to trigger a Phoenix protocol upon the verified notification of my death, or rather, the legal declaration of it. The notification had been issued by the authorities following the discovery of the wreckage, and the effect was instantaneous. I watched on the monitor as Lachlan attempted to use the supplementary American Express card I had entrusted him with for business expenses. He was at a high-end boutique in Collins Street, flanked by Sharon, who was busy pointing out diamond-encrusted timepieces. The clerk swiped the card with a polite smile, but the machine emitted a sharp, dissonant beep that froze the room. Lachlan's frustration was palpable. He gestured aggressively, his face flushing a deep, mottled red, clearly insisting that there had been a mistake. The clerk tried a second time, then a third. Finally, the manager intervened, his expression shifting from service-oriented politeness to stern professional distance. He did not return the card. Instead, he produced a pair of scissors and snipped the plastic into useless shards before their eyes. The public humiliation was total. They stood in the center of the showroom, the weight of 1,000 judging eyes bearing down on them, their aura of unearned entitlement evaporating into the stale, conditioned air. When they returned to the house in the suburbs, the atmosphere had shifted from celebratory to frantic. They were no longer the victors of an inheritance. They were fugitives from a system that had suddenly slammed its doors shut. I watched through the internal cameras as they paced the living room, their voices rising in a discordant symphony of panic. Every single account is frozen, Sharon. Lachlan roared, throwing his jacket onto the floor. The probate lawyer says the estate is under an indefinite audit by the bank's fraud department. How is this possible? Sharon, who had maintained a veneer of icy control until this moment, was finally beginning to fracture. She tore through the kitchen cabinets, searching for the emergency cash reserves I had long since relocated. He could not have moved them. The accounts were linked to the business registry. He was a simple man, Lachlan. He didn't have the foresight to hide millions. He clearly did. Lachlan shouted back, his voice thick with the desperation of a man who realized his bookies in the city were not going to be pacified by promises of future wealth. We are sitting in a house we cannot pay for, driving cars that will be repossessed by the end of the week. We have to find where he hid the physical keys to the offshore trusts. They began to dismantle the house with a feverish, destructive intensity. It was no longer a search for assets. It was an act of violence against the memories contained within those walls. They ripped the crown molding from the ceiling and tore the carpet from the floorboards, their faces distorted by a raw, unadulterated greed that had finally stripped away their humanity. Watching them, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. They were trapped in a cage of their own design, frantically gnawing at the bars, oblivious to the fact that I was the one who held the only key to their salvation, or their final destruction. The stage was set. The desperation I had meticulously engineered was now driving them toward the final, fatal mistakes I needed them to commit. The silence in the sterile, dimly lit room of the private clinic was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of the heart monitor, a sound I had forced my body to synchronize with for days. I lay motionless, my skin pale and mapped with the subtle, deliberate bruising applied by the theatrical makeup artist Dante had commissioned. This was my sanctuary of deception, a place where I had become a ghost in my own body, waiting for the inevitable moment when my enemies would be lured into the final chamber of the trap. Through my half-closed eyelids, I watched as the door opened, the air shifting with the heavy, cloying scent of Sharon's perfume, a floral veil that could no longer hide the rot beneath her skin. She entered with a performative air of tragic determination, her hand hovering near the monitors as if she were a devoted wife tending to a fading flame. I kept my breathing shallow, my heart rate steady, ensuring that every tremor of my muscles remained beneath the threshold of detection. "Bernie," she whispered, her voice a carefully curated blend of sorrow and expectation. She leaned in, her lips brushing my ear, but the whisper that followed was like a needle of ice. "Let go, Arthur. You are a hollow shell, a relic of a life that has already moved on. Just stop fighting, so we can stop pretending. The world will be so much lighter when you finally cease to exist." It took every fiber of my being to remain motionless. The rage behind my eyes was a physical pressure, a mounting tide that threatened to shatter my composure. I felt her hand press against my chest, not with the tenderness of a partner, but with the calculated pressure of someone checking to see if the spirit had truly departed. She was looking for a sign, a flickering of the eye or a catch in the breath, that would justify her next step. When I gave her nothing but the steady, monotonous rhythm of the monitor, she exhaled a breath that sounded disturbingly like relief. She moved to the corner of the room, where Lachlan stood in the shadows, his face a mask of nervous, predatory impatience. They began to whisper, their voices low and sharp, mapping out the final logistics of my transition. They were discussing the power of attorney, the immediate liquidation of the company's shares, and the absolute control they would wield the moment I was legally declared terminal. They truly believed that I was trapped in this state of vegetative imprisonment, that I was a passenger in my own mind, unable to witness the final orchestration of their treachery. As they spoke, the cruelty of their plans crystallized before me. They weren't just planning to inherit. They were planning to erase every trace of my existence, to ensure that the Arthur Miller they had discarded would be forgotten as swiftly as a broken machine. When they finally retreated, leaving me alone in the sterile quiet, I allowed myself a single, slow blink. The monitors continued their steady, deceptive cadence, but the man they had left behind was not the man they had poisoned. I had been forged in the crucible of their hatred, and the patience I had cultivated was now a weapon. I wasn't just waiting for them to finish their work. I was waiting for them to reach the zenith of their arrogance. The trap was set, the evidence was documented, and the time for the invalid to rise was rapidly approaching. Every word they had spoken, every touch of their hands, was now a permanent part of the case file that would eventually bury them. The shadows in the clinical suite seemed to lengthen as the hours dragged on, each minute serving as a deliberate exercise in controlled rage. I remained a prisoner of my own design, lying prone while the echoes of Sharon and Lachlan's conversation reverberated in my mind like a funeral dirge. They were finalizing the logistics for the transition, a term they used with chilling clinical detachment to describe my permanent removal from the business and the life I had built. However, the revelation that pushed me beyond the threshold of patience was their discussion regarding Leo. I had been listening to the audio feed transmitted through the hidden microphones in the suite. They were no longer focused solely on my estate. They were deliberating on how to dispose of my son. Lachlan's voice was devoid of any humanity as he outlined a plan to surrender Leo to the state care system, framing it as a tragic necessity born from Sharon's inability to cope with my supposed vegetative state. They calculated that by distancing themselves from a boy, they would not only remove a witness to their daily indiscretions, but also secure a government stipend for Sharon's emotional distress. The sheer audacity of the betrayal left me breathless. Sharon, the woman who had once stood at the altar and pledged her life to our family, was now treating our son like a discarded inventory item. She spoke of his future with the same cold indifference one might apply to the disposal of industrial waste, suggesting that he be transferred to a facility in a remote region of New South Wales to ensure he would never have to cross their path. Again, they were not just stealing my empire. They were attempting to liquidate the very heart of my existence. As the door clicked shut behind the departing medical staff, the heavy weight of the charade became almost unbearable. I waited until the floorboards in the hallway stopped creaking, ensuring that the coast was clear. I reached under the hospital bed frame, my fingers finding the small, cold edge of the burner phone I had taped there weeks ago. My movements were slow, deliberate, and agonizingly stiff, but the adrenaline pulsing through my veins served as a powerful antidote to the exhaustion. I pulled up Dante's contact, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light of the room. My heart rate flickered for a fraction of a second, but I forced it back into a steady, rhythmic pattern. The evidence I had gathered, the recordings of their conspiracy, the financial records of their attempted fraud, and now the documented intent to abandon a minor, was more than sufficient to dismantle their world. I typed the message with a focus that bordered on the divine. It was the signal I had promised. The time for observation had definitively passed. There was no longer any room for half measures or the hope that they might eventually experience a shred of conscience. They had chosen to discard the innocent, and in doing so, they had forfeited any claim to leniency. I slipped the phone back into its hiding place and lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling. The invalid was finished. The architect of their destruction was ready to take the floor. I closed my eyes, visualizing the sequence of events that would follow, knowing that when I opened them next, the world would finally see the true faces of the people who had dared to call themselves my family. The storm was no longer approaching. It was already here, and I was the one holding the lightning. The heavy oak front door of my suburban Melbourne home, the sanctuary I had built with decades of honest labor, swung open with a resounding thud that silenced the chaos within. I stepped across the threshold, not as the frail, poison mechanic they had wished for, but as Arthur Miller, the unyielding architect of Jefferson Logistics. Dante flanked me, moving with the quiet, lethal efficiency of shadow, sealing the exit behind us. The living room was a scene of frantic devastation, upholstery shredded, floorboards pried open, and drawers emptied. It was the physical manifestation of Sharon and Lachlan's ravenous, unfulfilled greed. In the center of the wreckage stood my daughter, Chloe, her face pale and streaked with tears, clutching a portfolio of documents. Lachlan had cornered her, his face twisted into an ugly, unfamiliar snarl of absolute desperation. "You will sign the asset transfer, Chloe," Lachlan spat, his voice dripping with venom, oblivious to the shift in the room's atmosphere. "Your father is gone, and this empire belongs to us now. Stop being a sentimental fool." "She will not sign anything," I stated. My voice was not a shout, but it possessed a low, commanding resonance that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Lachlan froze, his hands still suspended aggressively in the air. He turned slowly, his eyes widening to a grotesque degree as they locked onto me. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. Across the room, Sharon dropped a silver decor piece she had been holding. The heavy metal clattered against the hardwood floor with a deafening ring. She backed away until she hit the wall, her hands trembling uncontrollably, staring at me as if she were confronting a specter that had clawed its way out of the great ocean road wreckage. "Arthur," Sharon whispered, the word barely escaping her constricted throat. "It cannot be. The police said the vehicle burned." "A vehicle burned, Sharon." "I did not," I replied, taking a measured step into the room. I did not raise my fists. Physical violence was too crude a tool for this moment. Instead, I brought the crushing, undeniable weight of absolute authority. I looked at my daughter, who was staring at me with a mixture of profound shock and overwhelming relief. "Come here, Chloe." She bypassed her husband without a second glance and rushed to my side, burying her face against my shoulder. I held her securely, grounding her against the nightmare she had just awakened to. "You thought you were clever, Lachlan," I continued, my gaze locking onto my son-in-law, who was now visibly shaking. "You thought my wealth was a buffet, and my life was the admission ticket. But you severely underestimated the man who built the table. The accounts are frozen because I commanded it. The offshore trusts are sealed because I designed them to be impenetrable to parasites. Every conversation you had in this house, every drop of arsenic you steeped into my evening tea, and every pathetic plan you made to abandon my son to the state. I recorded it all." Dante stepped forward, placing a sleek audio device on the ruined coffee table. With the press of a button, Sharon's cold, calculated voice filled the room, discussing the poison and her profound disdain for Leo. The undeniable proof hung in the air, a suffocating blanket of truth. Chloe gasped, turning to look at the man she had married and the woman she had called her stepmother, finally recognizing the grotesque monsters hiding beneath their tailored clothes and expensive perfumes. I watched as the remaining fragments of their arrogance shattered. I did not need to strike them. The psychological dismantling was already complete. They had no money, no leverage, no alibi, and nowhere to run. They were utterly broken, trapped in the inescapable, glaring light of their own malevolence. The air in the living room had become thick with the scent of stagnant air and the metallic tang of exposed secrets. Lachlan, stripped of his bravado, scrambled backward until he hit the cold marble of the fireplace hearth, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold them steady. Beside him, Sharon stood frozen, her eyes darting between Dante's stoic presence and the incriminating evidence spilling from the audio device. She looked small, stripped of the manicured perfection that had defined her presence in our home for the past decade. "It was a misunderstanding," Lachlan stammered, his voice rising into an unmanly, frantic pitch. "Sharon, she was the one who pushed for the trusts, for the medical interventions. I was in debt, Arthur. I was being pressured. You know how the logistics market is. One bad quarter, and you are underwater. I didn't want to hurt anyone." I watched him with a cold, detached curiosity, the way a scientist might observe a specimen undergoing a final, pathetic convulsion. "You are not a victim of the market, Lachlan. You are a victim of your own insatiable appetite," I said, my voice steady, slicing through his desperate excuses. I walked toward him, each step measured and heavy, forcing him to shrink further into the hearth. "You didn't just want the money. You wanted the power that came with it. You wanted the prestige of my name, all while conspiring to end my life and discard my son as if he were an inconvenience." Sharon suddenly lunged forward, her mask of composure dissolving into pure, unadulterated vitriol. "He is right," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Lachlan. "It was his plan. He brought the chemicals. He made the calls to the creditors. I only went along with it because I was afraid of what he would do to me if I refused." Their betrayal of each other was instantaneous, a final, reflexive act of self-preservation that served only to confirm their mutual guilt. I looked at them, two people who had claimed to love me, who had sat at my dinner table, broken bread with me, and discussed their future in my home, and I felt a profound, liberating lack of empathy. They weren't fighting for morality. They were fighting for the sinking remains of their own reputations. "The time for your revisions of history has passed," I said, signaling to Dante. Dante produced a folder, a comprehensive compilation of bank statements, encrypted email logs, and sworn affidavits from the individuals they had attempted to recruit for their fraud. It was a roadmap of their destruction, meticulously documented and ready for the authorities. Lachlan looked at the folder as if it were a death warrant. He tried to lunge for it, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, but Dante merely stepped aside, allowing Lachlan to collapse onto the floor, a broken figure in an oversized, expensive suit. Chloe, standing by my side, reached out and took my hand. Her grip was tight, a silent affirmation that she had finally detached herself from the web they had spun around her. I looked at my daughter and saw not the fragile girl who had been manipulated by Lachlan's charisma, but a woman who was finally seeing the world with eyes wide open. The monsters were still in the room, but their power had been completely extinguished. They were no longer the masters of our destiny. They were merely suspects waiting for the inevitable arrival of justice. Every lie they had whispered, every ounce of poison they had poured, had led them to this precise, irreversible conclusion. The atmosphere felt lighter, despite the lingering stench of their deceit, as we waited for the final act to commence. The transition from the velvet-lined opulence of the ballroom to the suffocating chill of the service alley was a descent into a different world, yet the true theater was still unfolding on stage. The police sirens did not arrive as a rescue. They arrived as the final hammer blow in the meticulously staged demolition of Hunter and Sharon's reality. As the heavy sirens began to wail, cutting through the sophisticated murmurs of the gala, the ballroom doors swung open to reveal Detective Miller, his face a mask of ironclad professionalism. Hunter, standing amidst the ruins of his stolen triumph, did not immediately surrender. For a fleeting second, his eyes darted toward the side exit, a desperate, predatory instinct to escape. But then he saw me. He saw the cold, unwavering gaze of the man he had spent months trying to bury. His bravado didn't just crack, it disintegrated. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling violently, not from the weight of the handcuffs, but from the realization that his entire universe had been a house of cards. "You knew," Hunter whispered, his voice a ragged, broken sound that carried over the sudden silence of the crowd. "You were watching us the entire time." "I was not just watching," I replied, my voice slicing through the room like a blade. "I was documenting your descent." Detective Miller moved with the precision of a surgeon, ignoring Hunter's pathetic attempts at deflection. He didn't just read the charges. He recited the geography of their betrayal, the pharmacy records of the arsenic, the encrypted financial transfers, the cold, calculated logs of their plan to dispose of my son. Each detail fell like a heavy stone into the consciousness of the room. When the handcuffs finally snapped shut around Hunter's wrists, the metallic click was the only sound in the vast hall, a sharp, final period at the end of his parasitic existence. Sharon's collapse was quieter and far more devastating. As the officers turned their attention to her, she didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply stood still, her gaze drifting toward the projection screen that still held the damning evidence of her treachery. She looked at Chloe, who stood beside me, unmoving and resolute. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine terror in Sharon's eyes. Not the terror of being caught, but the terror of realizing she had lost her only anchor to the world of power she so desperately craved. As I led her away, she paused. She didn't look at the police. She looked at me, her eyes hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated resentment. "You always were a simple mechanic, Arthur," she hissed, her voice a fragile, venomous thread. "You don't understand that people like us are designed to take what we want. You may have won the round, but the world is still full of people who are hungrier than you. Hunger is not a virtue when you have no soul, Sharon," I replied, turning my back on her as the heavy doors eclipsed her silhouette. I stood by the window, watching the cruisers exit the property, their lights fading into the Melbourne night. Chloe moved beside me, her silence eloquent. The house of cards had finally fallen, and the air felt clean, purged of the toxic presence that had lingered in my home for far too long. Detective Miller lingered for a moment, his eyes scanning the room with a weary understanding of the tragedy that had unfolded. "The threat is neutralized, Arthur," Miller said, his tone softened by a genuine, if brief, empathy. "You are safe." "I am more than safe," I replied, watching the last of the police vehicles disappear into the distance. "I'm finally awake." After the officers departed, the ballroom fell into a profound, heavy silence. Dante remained briefly to oversee the secure transfer of the final documents, his presence as steady and unremarkable as a shadow. When he finally left, The stillness that descended was not the oppressive quiet of a trap, but the peaceful, expansive stillness of a sanctuary reclaimed. Chloe looked around at the remnants of the evening, the abandoned glasses, the hushed whispers of the elites who had witnessed the fall of the Vance dynasty. She didn't weep. She simply straightened her posture and looked at me with eyes that mirrored my own resolve. The purge was complete. The past was in handcuffs, and for the first time in a decade, the future was an unwritten page that belonged entirely to us. The lakeside air at our retreat in the Dandenong Ranges was a profound balm, a sharp contrast to the suffocating confines of the suburban life we had left behind. 1 year had passed since the night of the purge, a year defined not by the shadow of the past, but by the deliberate, steady rhythm of reconstruction. I stood on the deck as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, painting the water in hues of bruised violet and burning gold. Behind me, the house was alive with the sounds of a life actually being lived. Leo was laughing, his voice unburdened and clear as he practiced his football skills on the lawn, and Chloe was inside, her presence signaled by the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard as she managed the logistics of our enterprise with a competence that both humbled and amazed me. I had long since ceased to be the mechanic who hid his wealth behind a veneer of simplicity. I had become something else, a father who had been granted a reprieve from his own funeral. The lake house was my monument to that second chance. It wasn't a fortress of high walls and hidden agendas. It was a home built on the radical honesty we had finally earned. I called out, my voice resonant and steady, and within moments, they joined me on the deck. We sat at the patio table, a small, unbreakable circle of survivors. There was no need for grand speeches. The weight of our shared history was a silent, understanding presence. I placed the leather briefcase on the table, the latch clicking with a finality that signaled the end of my final secret. Inside, I had arranged the legal architecture for their futures. I slid a trust document toward Leo and the formal transfer of executive power to Chloe. This is not a reward, I said, looking at them both. This is the recognition of your own strength. Leo, you were the conscience that kept me from drifting into the dark. Chloe, you were the resilience that kept our legacy from being dismantled by the greedy. You earned your freedom long before I handed you these papers. Chloe took my hand, her eyes clear and devoid of the fear that had once haunted them. We aren't just surviving anymore, Dad. We are building something that is actually ours. We spoke of the future, of expansion, of new ventures, and of the quiet, unremarkable joy of a life without traps. But as the conversation drifted, the ghost of the past briefly flickered. I thought of Hunter in his cell, a man whose ambition had become his own cage, staring at concrete walls instead of the horizon. I thought of Sharon, drifting somewhere in the anonymous gray of the city, a woman who had traded her soul for a status she could never truly possess. They weren't just defeated. They were erased from the trajectory of our lives, rendered irrelevant by the sheer weight of their own failures. As the first stars began to pierce the twilight, I leaned back, feeling the tension of 40 years finally drain from my shoulders. I was 70 years old, a man who had been poisoned, betrayed, and declared dead, yet I had never felt more vibrant. I raised my glass to the stillness of the lake. We had learned that family is not defined by the blood you share, but by the people who stand beside you when the house is on fire. I had been a fool to believe that peace was something you could buy, but I was a fortunate man to have discovered that true peace is something you have to defend with your very life. I looked at my children, the architects of my new world, and knew that whatever storms might gather on the horizon, we were finally, irrevocably home. The war was over, but the victory wasn't in the wealth I had reclaimed. It was in the laughter echoing off the water, and the knowledge that I had finally, truly learned how to live.